we shouldn't be surprised with all that's coming out and all the worries about tariffs. It's not just that, it's the complexity of everything else as well. The changes within the federal government, the worries about job losses, the worries about a slowing economy, higher inflation, and eventually you get these what's known as soft data.
Today, the world witnessed an unexpected and decisive move by Hong Kong, which seemed preoccupied with economic and political issues that masked its complex relationship with the United States and China. Imagine Hong Kong, that financial and commercial hub, that long-standing symbol of East-West unity, suddenly announces the suspension of all postal and logistical ties with the United States. A country whose market has been a key link for millions of goods is now taking a decisive step in response to Donald Trump's tariff hikes. But what's behind this decision? And why has it come as such a shock to the world?
Well, if they did fall on deaf ears, but it's just the latest example in the really day by day, the deepening trade war that is underway between the United States and China. Yes, we are learning that U.S. officials privately behind the scenes urged China to not retaliate. In fact, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been saying that publicly all along, warning countries to not retaliate. Well, those warnings have fallen on deaf ears, particularly with China, as they raised their tariffs to 125%. The question now is which side is going to blink?
Hong Kong, once seen as the East's gateway to the world, has now found itself at the center of a trade war between two great powers, the US and China. For many, the move came as a shock, but for Hong Kongers themselves, it wasn't just a reaction to the tariffs, it was a cry for help. Thousands of companies, thousands of jobs and billions of dollars are all at risk. Even the smallest decisions can now dramatically alter the future of an entire economy. Postal services, which have been the backbone of huge flows of goods, are now in danger of being shut down. But how will this affect Hong Kong itself? And what lies in store for those caught in the middle of this economic storm?
The Chinese impression is that they are willing to at least negotiate, not necessarily on Donald Trump's terms, but to talk. But their impression is that the U.S. has not opened channels and not made an effort to open up channels.
There is much more behind this decision than just a fight for economic independence. Hong Kong is sending a clear message: we will not submit to American decisions. But is this really true? Won't this move lead to even more serious political isolation? After all, there are consequences behind every act, and the repercussions of this move could affect not only Hong Kong's economy, but also global markets.
In other words, pre-substitution, if we just continue as we are now. But of course, people will start to substitute. They will find other goods. And as the Christmas Tree Association said a moment or two ago, it's going to be very difficult to find substitution of many things that we currently get from China.
But what will happen next? How will an escalating trade war affect this situation? And will Hong Kong be able to cope with the flood of economic problems that has already hit the country? Perhaps this is the beginning of a new phase in the trade war, or perhaps a completely unexpected turn in relations between the US and China. But one thing is certain: the consequences of this move will go far beyond Hong Kong. Let's find out how Hong Kong and the US can weather this storm, and what this move means for the entire global market.
Surveys like the Michigan survey, consumer sentiment, and it's a really worrying number because at some point these sentiment surveys feed into hard data of real consumer spending, and we know this from history and precedent. That's what happens. So when we see a number as bad as this one, it is only a matter of time, unless anything else changes that would suddenly make people more cheerful. Look at that chart. I mean, just look at it. Unless people suddenly become more cheerful, why would this not translate into spending? You see, that consumer lab, the lab from Yale, that number of 4,700, that is providing you don't start substituting goods.
Hong Kong, once an important transit point for goods from China to the world, has made an unexpected move that has shaken up the global market and caught the attention of not only economists, but also politicians around the world. In response to the escalation of the trade war with the United States, caused by increased tariffs on Chinese goods, Hong Kong announced the suspension of all postal and logistics services with the United States. The decision came as a huge surprise, even for China, which has always supported Hong Kong in its status as a financial and trade center. For many, the move was a clear signal that Hong Kong is ready to move beyond words and demonstrate its independence, even if it comes with serious economic consequences.
Yeah, you'll be surprised just how much we get exclusively from China. And Jim, I'm really curious to get your perspective on the White House's handling of this situation. Not so much the tariffs that have been announced, but this reporting that the White House, that officials have made clear to Beijing that they want Xi to ask for a call with Trump.
The decision to suspend postal ties with the US was no accident. It was a logical continuation of the political and economic tensions that had been brewing for months. Hong Kong authorities, trying to express their protest against Trump's tariffs, at first made only sharp remarks, but soon the situation became so critical that extreme measures had to be resorted to. Hong Kong was known as a powerful logistics hub through which a huge amount of goods passed, especially in the technology and electronics sector. However, the increase in US tariffs on Chinese goods hit not only China itself, but also Hong Kong businesses that were closely tied to the Chinese economy.
Up. You're seeing that swing here going into the afternoon, up almost 650 points. But it was up and down there throughout earlier in the day. With us now, we have CNN business editor-at-large Richard Quest. We have CNN chief national security analyst Jim Sciutto as well. Richard, a key economic gauge, the consumer sentiment now at its second lowest level on record, going back to 1952. Why?
According to information from Hong Kong manufacturers, the decision to suspend postal shipments from the US was the final point behind a number of economic factors that resulted from Washington's growing aggression in trade relations. Tariffs on Chinese goods, which have doubled, have forced Hong Kong companies to suffer huge losses. Exporters such as Hayton Lee, which specialized in high-tech components for the US market, began to feel the effects of this trade war. They faced a sharp decline in demand for their products and increased shipping costs. The costs of shipping goods to the US, including additional duties and inspections, were so high that many companies began to seriously consider withdrawing from the US market altogether. At a time when tariffs on Chinese goods can reach 200 to 300%, exports to the US were becoming increasingly unprofitable.
Right now, 145 going up against 125. These are the tariffs between the world's two biggest economies.
And here's another number, 4,700 or about $400 per month. That is how much more money Yale's now estimating, the Yale Budget Lab, that President Trump's tariffs are going to cost average households each year. And with just hours left in trading, the Dow right now.
Hong Kong's decision to suspend postal and logistics services with the US could not go unnoticed. It disrupted the usual order of international trade and was a clear signal that even seemingly small steps can have a significant impact on the global market. Experts predicted that, in the short term, the move would increase logistics costs, as businesses trying to find alternative routes for delivery would face high transportation costs. Some companies have even started to look for ways to circumvent US tariffs, such as through third countries, which has also led to additional costs and business complexity. So, Hong Kong found itself in the middle of an economic and political storm that left its future in serious doubt. However, despite this, many in Hong Kong, as well as in China, felt that the move was necessary to express their position and protect the economic independence of the region, even if it required certain sacrifices. In the near future, everything will depend on how long Hong Kong can resist US pressure and whether its economy will be prepared to survive the possible consequences of such a decision.
Lived in China, you've covered China for some time now. As we're looking at this question of who's going to blink first, with two very different political systems, what is your gauge on this?
Well, different systems, listen, one's a democracy, one is not. One's a single-party state, very much not a democracy. But China does have politics, and Chinese leaders do not want to be seen, we were talking about this yesterday, I believe, do not want to be seen as capitulating to America. That is not good politics for a Chinese leader.
When Hong Kong decided to suspend postal and logistics services with the US, many people did not realize the profound economic and social impact this would cause. The disruption to logistics and transportation flows was not limited to mail. The move affected the entire spectrum of commerce, from small packages to large shipments. The day after the announcement of the suspension of postal services, there were serious problems in export and import operations. Many companies, including small startups and large corporations in the high-tech and consumer goods sectors, faced serious delays. Shipping goods into the US was now impossible, which meant that both sellers and buyers were in limbo.
Including Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Kentucky bourbon. President Trump with the Irish Prime Minister visiting the White House today. The president suggesting his tariffs won't stop here, saying, of course, I'm going to respond. And tonight, right here, the new poll showing 56% of Americans disapprove of President Trump's handling of the economy. The number's even worse now on the president's tariffs. ABC's chief White House correspondent, Mary Bruce, leading us off.
Today, President Trump side by side in the Oval Office with the head of the Irish government.
However, the problem was not limited to small businesses. Some of the biggest players in the maritime and aviation logistics industry, such as Seabridge, reported massive cancellations of contracts with Hong Kong ports. Due to additional inspections and duties imposed in the US, it has become uneconomic for their clients to use Hong Kong ports as transit ports. Problems with transshipment and increased transportation costs created not only financial difficulties, but also logistical congestion, which, according to experts' forecasts, could lead to a 30% reduction in turnover in Hong Kong ports in the short term. These difficulties were not ignored in the country itself. In Hong Kong, where most people were closely tied to the export economy, rumors of possible mass unemployment quickly began to spread among workers and entrepreneurs. The predictions were grim. If the situation did not normalize within 3 months, up to 500,000 people could lose their jobs as a result of layoffs in the export-import sector. Expectations were quickly justified. Without a visible change in the political situation in the country, many firms began to close en masse, exacerbating the economic crisis. The protests were not long in coming. Against the backdrop of the economic downturn, which led to rising unemployment and higher prices for imported goods, social discontent began to grow. Many small and medium-sized entrepreneurs began to oppose the actions of the Hong Kong authorities, claiming that the patriotic struggle fees were too high for their businesses. The Hong Kong Small Business Union issued a statement saying that the forced termination of postal and logistics services with the United States will lead to the destruction of small businesses, which form the backbone of the economy. It was obvious to millions of Hong Kong residents that the country was facing its biggest economic disaster since returning to Chinese sovereignty.
But it's also an opening to say, okay, we're capping this for now, and that perhaps offers a way forward that we could begin talking about how to bring these down.
By the time a few months had passed since the sanctions were imposed, the impact on port and air transportation had become even more pronounced. Experts predicted that the loss of the US market could reduce Hong Kong's economic growth by 3 to 4% per year. And considering that Hong Kong had previously been one of the fastest-growing financial and trade centers in Asia, these figures spoke for themselves. But the most serious consequence has been a sharp decline in the number of jobs in export sectors. Predictions of up to 1 million job losses did not seem too far from reality. What drew particular attention was the increase in unemployment among workers in industries such as transportation, warehousing, logistics, and manufacturing. Workers previously accustomed to stability and high wages were now forced to find alternative sources of income. One of the major carriers stated that mass layoffs had already begun in its company, and its employees began to appeal to labor unions to support them in the crisis. This in turn provoked a wave of strikes and protests which became regular.
To allow that. So now you have the U.S. president say, well, I'm not going to open those channels. China has to open them first. It's kind of ridiculous at the end of the day because you are playing with the interests of American consumers, Chinese consumers, etc. The other point I would make about China's reaction today in not quite meeting the U.S. tariffs, 145%, U.S.-China goes to 125%. And in Xi's statement, he says, we're going to 125 in response. That's as high as we're going because this is getting a little ridiculous, right? And that's both a signal to say we're not going to get caught up in this tit for tat to the degree that the president is.
Social tensions reached their peak when, in response to the growing number of protesters, the Hong Kong government announced the possible intervention of the police to ensure order. However, instead of reducing the level of discontent, this only spurred protesters to demand more drastic steps from the government. Tensions on the streets of the city grew, and this led to an even more intense political conflict within Hong Kong itself, where different factions of local elites began vying for control of the economic situation. This political crisis was exacerbated by the fact that anti-Chinese sentiment among the Hong Kong population was increasing amidst the worsening economic situation. Many residents began to look to Beijing not as a protector of their position, but as a source of additional problems. Slogans condemning China's interference in Hong Kong's affairs began to spread on social networks and at rallies. Among other things, there was even a hypothesis that against the backdrop of this US trade with China, Hong Kong would eventually be integrated into China's economy to the detriment of its economic interests. Although the Hong Kong authorities tried to strengthen their stance in response to such claims, more and more people became skeptical of further measures.
The more likely it is to have them come into
the higher the tariff, the more you're going to put on the value of that piece, those goods, the higher people are going to pay in shops.
In the end, despite the government's efforts to mitigate the effects of these economic problems, Hong Kong's businesses and economy were on the brink. The losses from the cessation of trade with the US were so significant that if the situation continued, Hong Kong would face massive bankruptcies and severe economic consequences that some analysts believe could lead to the region's worst crisis in modern history. The economic consequences of the trade war, including the suspension of postal and logistics services with the United States, led to a significant drop in investor confidence, especially in Hong Kong's financial sector. Within weeks of the imposition of sanctions, there was already sharp volatility in stock markets. Hong Kong's largest banks and investment companies, such as Pacific Finance and Hong Kong Global Investments, saw their share values fall sharply. The fear of uncertainty was so great that experts began to suggest that Hong Kong markets could lose up to 15 to 20% of their total value in the short term. Large funds focused on the Asian market were also affected as the US continued to increase pressure on Hong Kong by withdrawing capital.
They're doing what they should be doing, perhaps, for the European Union, but it does create ill will. And as you know, we're going to be doing reciprocal tariffs. So whatever they charge us, we're charging them.
Analysts predicted that if the trade war continued for at least a few more months, Hong Kong could face a real financial crisis. Major banks began reviewing their investments in Hong Kong, causing a massive exodus of capital. Banks dealing with Chinese and Hong Kong corporations were particularly acutely affected and were now forced to find new ways to minimize risk. Just 2 months after the trade conflict began, Hong Kong Banking Corp reported that their net profit had fallen by 30%. Presumably, this was due to the volatility in the markets and a drop in lending among small and medium-sized enterprises. Along with this, the situation of foreign currency reserves in Hong Kong also worsened and began to decline rapidly. The exodus of investment and increased economic instability led many multinational corporations operating in Hong Kong to reassess their strategic plans. A number of large multinational enterprises, including oil and gas company Shell Asia and technology giant Apple, began to relocate some of their operations to other parts of Asia, such as Singapore and South Korea. However, this decision could not compensate for all the losses that Hong Kong suffered due to the loss of the American market.
Well, when you look at the kind of input Musk has been having into politics, there has been some polling done which suggests there is a strong dissatisfaction with.
In response to this economic turmoil, Hong Kong authorities began to announce that they were willing to take more drastic steps to stabilize the situation. The Hong Kong government began to look for ways to reduce its dependence on exports to the United States by trying to develop trade with Europe and other Asian countries. However, experts noted that this would be a long and costly process requiring massive investment in infrastructure. Any attempts to regain lost positions in the global market were expected to take at least 5 years. Moreover, Hong Kong would face many challenges, including the lack of already established logistics routes that could compete with highly efficient and competitive US transit routes. Amid the economic crisis and growing social protests, another threat has emerged. If the crisis continues, Hong Kong could face massive bankruptcies. In the middle of the year, experts predicted that at least 30% of small and medium-sized enterprises engaged in exports would be forced to close down. According to the Hong Kong Chamber of Commerce, about 15,000 companies, mainly from the logistics and manufacturing sectors, may be at risk of bankruptcy. In some cases, liquidity problems have led even large corporations to cut their operating costs, laying off employees and reducing their scale of operations. It is projected that if trade with the US were to stop completely, Hong Kong could lose about $60 billion a year, which would amount to nearly 5% of its GDP. one of the most disturbing symptoms of economic instability has been rumors of a possible wave of mass protests. Hong Kong has been the scene of street demonstrations many times before, and this crisis has only fueled discontent among workers and entrepreneurs. Immediately after the announcement that postal and logistics services with the United States would be cut off, protests broke out in several parts of the city. Hundreds of people began gathering in the streets, demanding that the government reconsider its approach to trade issues. The situation escalated as activist groups began calling for stronger measures, including Hong Kong's political autonomy from China. Many protesters were opposed to the dictates of Beijing and accused the Hong Kong government of having too close ties with Chinese authorities, which they felt did not take into account the interests of the city's own residents. This caused even more tension in Hong Kong's political life, where the government was forced to increase security measures. The police and army became increasingly visible on the streets in an attempt to control the situation and prevent riots. Meanwhile, Hong Kong authorities also tried to create a semblance of stability by providing various subsidies and loans to small businesses to help them survive the crisis. However, many experts warned that these measures would have little effect without a long-term reform program. Meanwhile, as social instability increased and living standards fell, the issue of Chinese support became more and more urgent. China, as one of Hong Kong's largest economic partners, pressured local authorities to take stronger measures. Beijing had already made no secret of its readiness to intervene in Hong Kong's economic affairs if the situation got out of control. Internal contradictions between the local government and Beijing began to flare up, and experts began to say that this could lead to a further weakening of Hong Kong's autonomy. Hong Kong was on the brink of not only economic but also political disaster. If the crisis continues to deepen, changes in the political structure of the region are possible, which will lead to its even greater dependence on China. At the same time, it will be difficult to find consensus in international politics, as the US and China will continue to fight for influence in the region. It is unlikely that Hong Kong will be able to maintain its status as a financial hub if it cannot deal with the domestic economic and political problems that plague it. This conflict, which began as a trade war, has already catalyzed deeper changes in Hong Kong's economic and political life. The key question now becomes whether Hong Kong can survive in this new environment, and how long the struggle for its economic independence will continue.